Now, dominating the front pages this past weekend was Julius Malema's plan to take over the ANC. To look more at these stories and others making headlines, we're joined in studio by Varashni Pillay of the Mail and Guardian. Varashni, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Rory. Thanks for having me.
Obviously, all the talk this past weekend is the ANC Youth League conference. Julius Malema being re-elected unopposed.
Yeah.
Is that good for a leader to be appointed head of an organisation unopposed? I mean, is that democratic?
Yeah, well, it is democratic technically because his contender Lebogang Maeli did step down voluntarily. But in terms of being good for the organisation, I don't think so. What we saw this weekend was a very tightly controlled ANC Youth League. There was fears that we'd have a repeat of Mangaung a few years ago when the ANC Youth League conference where Malema was elected was quite a joke. People were mooning each other, delegates were throwing chairs, there was huge amounts of fighting between opposition factions. This time round, there was nothing. It was a very tightly controlled show. This does well for Malema, makes him look very in control, but also it makes one wonder about the internal democracy of the ANC Youth League and what that's like these days.
Yana, we're just chatting off air now. It's like a case of the tail wagging the dog.
Yes.
On the one hand, Julius is saying to President Zuma, we are your protector. And then 5 minutes later, he's effectively saying, listen, watch your back because we want a younger ANC leadership. What is the public supposed to make of that?
Well, I think it's quite clear that Malema has emerged from this conference incredibly powerful, more powerful than he was before. He has effectively told Zuma where to get off. I mean, in his opening address, he was conciliatory. He said things like, we are your protectors. In his closing address last night, which ran for 2 hours, he was far more harsh in his tone. He pretty much directly criticized Zuma for daring to discipline him, for using state resources.
You've got to be pretty confident that the power that you have to go and criticize the president of any country.
I know, exactly. And I mean, Ranjeni Munsami said on Twitter last night, which a lot of commentators have been quoting, is that she said, he has taken on leaders inside and outside the ANC and won. I mean, we've seen Malema emerging quite strong, and it's going to be an interesting 3 years ahead of us as he does his second term. Taking
a look at the Mail and Guardian, running with a couple of stories. I mean, obviously the big talking points, the proposed nationalisation of South African mines, the willing buyer, willing seller thing for land. They're proposing land grabs and that sort of thing. Derek Hanekom and Julius Malema getting into a bit of a Twitter feud.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's quite interesting. Derek Hanekom said quite vehemently on Twitter that he would never support nationalisation or rather expropriation of land without compensation in his lifetime. Never. This is a bit similar to the call made by Susan Shabangu, the minister, who made a similar thing and clashed hugely with Malema. And I mean, it's interesting to see that Malema effectively takes on these people quite harshly and there's no consequences. I mean, he is emerging to be quite a strong leader. So that's what happened there. And I mean, a big driving theme in terms of the resolutions that were adopted at the conference were both the nationalisation of mines, which has been a running theme for the Youth League, and now the expropriation of land without compensation, very similar to what people have been saying, the Zimbabwean land grabs and raising that spectre of violence.
And obviously a call by the ANC Youth League to the NEC and the ANC government to lift the lid on the succession debates. I mean, if you look at the percentage of the population that are youth, they're saying, well, listen, we need younger people in positions of power.
And I mean, they're really driving to get Fikile Mbalula in there. I think it's looking as though that's going to be likely. If Zuma wants to remain in power, he's going to have to bargain a little bit. And something that might happen is that he might trade off Gwede Mantashe, the Secretary General of the ANC, in favour of Fikile Mbalula, who turns 40. In fact, the Youth League keep quoting the fact that Walter Sisulu was 37 when he became Secretary General of the ANC Youth League. So they're trying to say there's a precedent for this. And of course, we saw Winnie Mandela lending her support last night, the so-called mother figure to Julius Malema. So there's been a lot of pressure on the Mother Party right now, a lot of pressure, and we're not really seeing Zuma take a firm stand here. He said a few things in his opening address on Friday, or rather Thursday, where he kind of tried to defend, his position, tried to defend the Constitution, but not enough. Not enough saying, we will work within the framework of our Constitution. We will not change the Constitution, because that's what Malema is trying to do, get a 2/3 majority to change the Constitution.
It's a case of the young teenage child getting a bit too tall and a bit too powerful for the parent.
Yeah.
Also in the Mail and Guardian, the interesting one is where apartheid statues go to lie. Obviously a lot of debates and fierce debates and emotion around the removal of the Hendrik Verwoerd bust in the Midvaal region.
And it's a really lovely story. It's one of those stories where the right just goes on a journey to find out about where these monuments go. It's not a situation unique to South Africa. After the fall of communism in Europe, we've seen a similar situation where monuments and statues are sort of trucked away. In the case of Midvaal, there was that fabulous incident where 10 o'clock at night, there was the bus was sort of taken away and driven off into the night by a guy called Pitt in some white bucky. So the writer kind of goes on this journey. And
sounds like a crime thriller novel.
It really does. And what he finds out is that actually all the apartheid monuments, including paintings of past leaders, are actually hosted by something called the Heritage Trust, in the Voortrekker Monument, and done quite carefully in an air-conditioned room and so on, where people can go and kind of see these things. But this particular bus, which was very contentious, the one in Midvaal, where we saw Jackson
just
Mthembu,
pre-local municipal elections.
Yeah, Jackson Mthembu releasing the statement saying that's disgusting that the DA have this bus still up. Never mind the fact that the ANC ran the municipality at one point and had the bus still up.
And we're quite happy to have the
yes,
bus
exactly.
there. Life is full of ironies in South Africa.
So that particular bus was taken to a farm belonging to a right-wing organisation in northeast Pretoria. It's been displayed next to the old South African flag. So it's become quite a symbol of contention, I think.
I suppose it always will. I mean, the way you look at it, I mean, however oppressive or offensive a certain section of the history is for any country, it's still history and you've got to preserve it. So I'm glad the Heritage Council is looking after that. Obviously, the Sunday Times focusing again on Malema, the statements that he's making, the call for the succession debate. I was very surprised by Winnie Mandela's comments at the closing of the ANC Youth League conference, comparing him to O.R. Tambo and Nelson Mandela. I think there's a fair few people out there that would disagree with that.
I know, it's quite a provocative statement. And I actually haven't seen it reported very widely, because I think several journalists were also shocked by the comparison. But I think it's in keeping with the kind of firebrand status of Mandela herself, Madikizela Mandela, and of Julius Malema, to say these kind of statements, to get people to really sit up and pay attention, which is what they're really good at doing.
Talking about sitting up and paying attention, the other story in the Sunday Times that grabbed my attention was the Director of Public Works, fearing for his safety. My phone was tapped. I was forced and coerced into approving certain police lease deals. Your take on that?
Well, I mean, what I find pretty shocking about that is the amount of intimidation that was used, allegedly. So now we've seen, the second public protector report coming out about the situation. This time she's tackling both police headquarters, both in Durban and Pretoria, and it's a damning report. She's taken on Gwen Mhlanga Nkabinde, the Minister of Public Works. She's taken on Bheki Cele, and she said, pretty damning things about how they've handled the situation, how clear it was that from the start these overblown bonds, these overblown state leases were intended for Rusha Bangu. There was no real process to kind of what should happen in these leases. Leases in themselves aren't a bad thing. What should really happen is that they should benefit black businessmen, black business people trying to make it.
And more than one.
And more than one. It should be broad-based, and it should be competitive. There was no competition here. I mean, these leases are ridiculous. You could buy a building at sometimes 2/3 of the price.
But what happens to the checks and balances? Surely there's checks and balances. I can't just go ahead and sign a lease.
And this is what the Sunday Times story is about. All the checks and balances were not taken into account. A lease over 500 or a certain amount, 500,000, I think, should be signed off by Treasury. That was not done. Bheki Cele flouted that process.
This is taxpayers' money that's going to be paying for these.
Yes, basically what's happening is that the government, which could effectively have bought that themselves, is now bought it from a businessman who's getting taxpayers to pay off his overblown bond. And in one case, he made 100 million rand over. The bank gave him 100 million more than he needed for the building. So we're paying off a neat kickback for him.
If government can afford to buy these buildings, I mean, it's the same as paying the bond on your own house as opposed to paying rent into someone else's bond. Why do government not go and buy these buildings then?
Apparently that's a resolution that Treasury, I believe, has announced that they will be doing in future to avoid cases like this. And that is one solution. I mean, the other solution is that we just make sure our internal mechanisms are obeyed, that things are signed off by Treasury, that you have an open tender process. I mean, these things did not go to tender. That's the first thing. They did not actually go to tender. So we're changing it now to say that government will buy their own buildings, but then that doesn't really benefit the business people out there.
Now, talking about the public protector, who protects the public protector?
Well, that's really a good point. I mean, we saw how Mushwana was not the best public protector during the Oilgate scandal. So now we have someone like Chilima Dansela, who really has impressed so many people with her fierce determination. And it's a bit frightening when one thinks that that person can easily be taken out. I mean, her previous recommendations in a previous report were not really followed through on. Nothing happened to the public protector.
How does the country or the citizens of the country insist that those recommendations are followed through, though?
I think through repeated engagement with government, through parliamentary processes, through media, through applying pressure, and I guess through our voter ultimately, in ensuring that the people we want to stay in do stay in power.
The Independent running with a story that I haven't seen in many other newspapers, the 4 truck drivers being held ransom. Yeah,
interesting that they put that quite far back. I suppose Malema just dominated the news. I thought that should have been front page news for them. But, I mean, that's quite a disturbing story about how 4 South African truck drivers were delivering some equipment to Grace Mugabe's farm, her dairy farm. That's quite controversial, and have been arrested, apparently in ransom, because her South African business partner, Taiwanese-born man, has transferred a Hong Kong property that was in her name into his name. And the property has now doubled in value. It was 40 million rand. And so obviously she wants this property back. And she effectively has just kept these drivers who don't really belong to this businessman anyway. He just hired independent drivers. But it's become a bit of a diplomatic issue because now they're trying to extradite this businessman who's known to his associates as Jack. And The hearing for the drivers are starting today. But the most disturbing part of the story is that she transferred the 7 million rand, about $1 million US, to buy this equipment in August 2008. This is when Zimbabwe was experiencing its worst hyperinflation. There was no money in the bank. There wasn't even Forex. No one knows where she got this money from.
Deeply disturbing. Well, let's hope that there's more than quiet diplomacy.
Yeah, let's hope
to that
so,
situation.
indeed.
Vareshni, thank you so much for coming in and joining us on Sunrise this morning.
Thank you.
Enjoy your day. That was Vareshni Pillay from the Mail and Guardian taking us through the news-making headlines this past week in South Africa. Do stay with us. We'll be right back.
The Sunrise Spirit Thought Save a Life campaign